In the heart of a village that seemed to thrive with wealth and color, yet secretly pulsed with envy and cruelty, there lived a girl whose gift was unlike any other. Her hands, slender and steady, could take the dullest scraps of cloth and turn them into gowns that shimmered as though sunlight had been trapped in the threads. From the time she was a child, elders had whispered that her talent was not entirely mortal, that the spirits of weaving had kissed her cradle and guided her fingers. Whenever she worked at her loom, there was an unexplainable rhythm in the air, like a song without sound, as if unseen voices hummed along with her needle. Her name had once been spoken with warmth in the village square, for those who wore her garments walked taller, shone brighter, and seemed touched by fortune. But fate has a cruel way of twisting the threads of destiny, and her path, instead of weaving beauty for herself, was shackled by chains of envy and oppression. Her mother, the one who had taught her the first stitches, had died when she was young, leaving her in the care of a father whose weakness lay not in malice but in blindness. When he remarried, he thought he was giving his daughter security, but instead, he delivered her into the grasp of a woman who wore smiles like masks and carried cruelty like a hidden dagger. This stepmother, cloaked in riches yet hollow in heart, soon bore daughters of her own, vain, sharp-tongued, and bitter. Where once the girl's gift had been celebrated, it became a tool for their greed. They discovered that gowns made by her hands fetched admiration from chiefs' wives and noblemen's brides, that the very air around her garments seemed enchanted. And so, with voices sweetened by false kindness, they commanded her to sew for them. At first she hoped kindness might win their love. She poured her heart into stitching their dresses, lacing them with beauty, weaving patterns that whispered of rivers, skies, and stars. Yet each time she presented her work, they responded not with gratitude but with scorn. Too plain, one sister sneered, though the dress shimmered like morning dew. Too stiff, the other hissed, though the fabric draped like flowing water. And the stepmother, cold and exacting, would shake her head and say, "Do it again. You will never be free until perfection drips from every seam." So the girl, clad in rags that smelled of soot and earth, bent her back to the loom again and again, while the gowns she made were paraded before the village as though her tormentors were the geniuses behind their creation. Days bled into nights, nights into weeks, and she began to feel as though her very life was being unraveled into the cloth she wove. Her fingers bore calluses, her skin cracked from endless work, but her spirit refused to break. Still, the world around her saw only a ragged slave, hunched at the loom, stitching beauty she was never allowed to wear. The cruel sisters laughed at her, flaunting their gowns in front of mirrors while whispering of dances and feasts they would attend. She was forbidden even to sit in the corner and watch. She was told that her place was with the needle, not among the noble. And so she wept, not the wailing sobs of anger but quiet, steady tears that fell silently onto the fabrics. She did not know it then, but her tears carried weight, for the spirits of the loom, the ancient guardians of thread and cloth, heard her sorrow. Every stitch, every drop of salt water, wove into the garments a story, a prayer, a curse wrapped in beauty. The spirits whispered to one another in voices only they could hear, "This child carries chains of cruelty, but see how she endures. See how she gives beauty even to those who give her none. Her sorrow is not wasted, it has soaked into the threads and the cloth remembers." The girl herself did not sense the full extent of their watching, but sometimes, when her tears struck the fabric, she noticed the thread seemed to glow faintly before dimming again. Sometimes the patterns formed by her needle twisted into shapes she had not planned, curving like rivers, branching like veins, glowing like fire hidden beneath ash. Her stepfamily did not notice these changes, too consumed with their own vanity. They only demanded more. "Sew faster," they ordered, "or you will have no food tonight." And so she stitched until her fingers bled, and when her blood stained the thread, she licked her wounds, letting the taste of iron remind her that she was still alive, still human, even if they treated her like nothing. But the spirits of the loom treasured each drop of her blood, each tear, each sigh, as if these were the sacrifices of a priestess. They wove her suffering into power, waiting for the moment when threads of sorrow would tighten into a rope of justice. Though no one saw it, she sang softly to herself as she worked, ancient lullabies her mother had once taught her. The tunes filled the loom room with a haunting peace. The gowns she sewed carried these songs within them, invisible but present, wrapping the wearers in melodies they could not hear yet which stirred strange feelings in their chests. Chiefs' wives who once laughed at her would find themselves trembling when they wore the gowns, unable to explain why their hearts beat so heavily. Daughters of nobility who danced in her dresses often dreamt of rivers overflowing, of storms chasing them, of vines curling around their throats. The gowns, beautiful as they appeared, had become vessels of something deeper, thread spun not only from cotton and silk, but from grief, from endurance, from the girl's spirit, and from the vengeance of the loom's guardians. Still, she remained silent, outwardly obedient, for what power did she have against those who owned her life? The stepmother held the keys to the chest of fabrics, the sisters paraded her work before the world, and the villagers saw only what they were meant to see: a family of elegance, daughters of refinement, a mother of prestige. But no one looked beyond the walls where the girl stitched her life away, her back bent like an old woman though her face was still that of youth. Yet inside something had begun to shift. She could feel a fire flickering in her chest, a quiet defiance, not yet fully formed but growing. She began to think of herself not as their servant but as a guardian of something greater, something they could never own. For though they stole her labor, her gift was still hers, and her soul belonged not to them but to the spirits who had never abandoned her. Sometimes at night, when the others slept, she touched the loom's wooden frame, worn smooth beneath her fingers, and whispered her heart to it. "I am more than these chains," she would say softly. "If my life must be sewn into cloth, let it not be wasted. Let the threads carry my truth. Let the spirits hear me." And the loom, ancient and listening, seemed to hum in response, its wood vibrating with a pulse like a heartbeat. She knew then she was not truly alone, even in her rags, even in her misery. Something larger than her suffering was being woven, something that reached beyond her stepmother's cruelty. The village never saw her in the gowns, never knew the face of the true creator. They only knew of a silent, ragged figure glimpsed through windows, hunched in endless work. But those with sharper eyes sometimes paused and felt unease, as if a shadow greater than human stood behind her when she sewed. Children passing the house whispered that they saw ghostly hands guiding hers, or that the sound of the loom at night was joined by voices that did not belong to mortals. Some avoided the path altogether, muttering that the stepmother's wealth was tainted, that no good would come from exploiting a girl who stitched with tears. And so the days stretched into months, the girl weaving sorrow into beauty, beauty into sorrow, while the spirits tightened their hold on the fabric of fate. Each stitch brought her closer to a reckoning unseen by her tormentors. Though she seemed bound, though her chains looked unbreakable, the loom had already begun cutting them in silence, strand by strand, waiting for the moment when the girl would rise, no longer a victim but the thread that unraveled her oppressor's power. The chief's palace gleamed with ambition, its walls heavy with gold, its halls echoing the laughter of those who had power and privilege. But ambition often breeds greed, and this chief's appetite for splendor knew no bounds. He had declared that a grand feast would be held to impress neighboring rulers, and he demanded a gown so magnificent that it would outshine the stars themselves. No ordinary cloth, no common design would satisfy him. He craved a garment that spoke of authority, wealth, and untouchable status. Whispers of the chief's demand raced through the village like wildfire, and many trembled at the thought of fulfilling it, for failure meant punishment, shame, or worse. Yet the step-family, cunning and unscrupulous, saw an opportunity in the chief's greed. They approached the girl, whose skill with needle and thread was legendary, and offered her for the task, though their eyes sparkled with cruelty rather than admiration. "You will make the gown," they said with false sweetness, "or the chief will punish us all. But perhaps we will allow you to live if you obey and work tirelessly." There was no choice for her. Refusal would bring wrath not only upon herself but upon anyone who dared intervene. And so, before the sun rose again, she was seized and brought to a small, dimly lit hut at the edge of the village, far from the laughter and lights of her tormentor's home. There she was locked in, the door heavy, the windows barred, the sky above visible only through a narrow crack. Inside the hut, the girl was left with nothing but the essentials of her craft. The finest thread she could find, needles sharp enough to pierce even the densest fabric, and bolts of cloth that seemed ordinary but awaited transformation at her skilled hands. She gazed at the materials, her heart heavy but resolute. She had sewn for others countless times, pouring life into garments that she herself would never wear. Yet this time the stakes were higher. The gown she would make was not just for beauty, it was demanded by a tyrant, a man whose greed could destroy her if she faltered. Still, even in fear, her hands tingled with the familiar hum of creation, the invisible presence of spirits who had always watched over her, whispering courage into her heart. Night descended, cloaking the hut in darkness, and the girl set to work. Every stitch, every pull of the thread, was deliberate, precise, and infused with silent prayer. She thought of her mother, who had taught her that cloth is more than fabric. It carries energy, intention, and sometimes the very essence of a person's soul. And so, she worked not just to appease her step-family or the chief, but to protect herself and the unseen guardians of her gift. As she stitched, her tears fell upon the cloth, invisible to the eye but heavy with meaning. With each drop, the fabric seemed to shimmer faintly, as if recognizing the weight of her sorrow and transforming it into resilience. The hut was small and time stretched endlessly, a cruel instrument of the stepfamily's making. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, fatigue weighed upon her limbs, yet she did not stop. The needle became an extension of her will, threading not only beauty but determination into every seam. Shadows flickered against the walls as the moon traced its slow arc across the night sky. Outside, the stepfamily and the chief anticipated the final product with impatience, unaware that the girl's silent defiance was already weaving a force beyond their control. The spirits, attentive and vigilant, watched each motion, each careful fold, each tear-stained thread, imbuing the gown with something more than elegance. It carried the essence of endurance, courage, and unseen power. Hours turned into days, and exhaustion pressed against her shoulders like a physical weight. Her fingers ached, her eyes burned, and her back cried from constant bending. Yet in this solitude she discovered a strange clarity. The hut, bare as it was, became her sanctuary, the loom and needle her instruments of quiet rebellion. Though the walls confined her body, her spirit stretched beyond them, reaching toward the stars the chief had desired to outshine. She whispered to the spirits, "Let my hands endure, let my work protect me, let the cloth speak the truth when others cannot." And though her voice was soft, the wind carried the sound beyond the hut, brushing against leaves and soil, awakening the ancient guardians who had long waited to act in moments of injustice. By the final night, the gown began to take shape, extraordinary and otherworldly. It shimmered with an inner light, threads glinting like moonlit rivers, folds that cascaded like waterfalls, and patterns that seemed to move subtly, alive with the energy of the girl's endurance. The hut, once oppressive and small, now felt charged with power, as though it had absorbed her determination and amplified it. Outside, the stepfamily grew impatient, their envy fermenting into irritation, but they dared not enter. They had unleashed her, they thought, and yet they could not foresee that the very fabric she wove carried the spirit of her resilience. As she finished the final stitches, the girl took a step back, hands trembling from fatigue yet proud of the work before her. The gown was more than cloth, it was a vessel of survival, an instrument of consequence, a silent messenger that no cruelty could break the essence of her spirit. The chains of oppression that her stepfamily had imposed upon her were mirrored and transformed in the delicate loops and intricate patterns of the gown. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also alive with power, waiting for the moment when it would speak in ways no human tongue could convey. The stepfamily, unaware of the true nature of her gift, collected the gown with smug satisfaction, eager to present it to the chief as a symbol of their cunning. They had thought only of spectacle, of pleasing the tyrant, of flaunting the girl's labor as proof of their superiority. Yet in their ignorance they carried with them a force they could not control. The spirits of the loom, the echoes of her mother's teachings, and the essence of her own indomitable heart had infused the fabric with something far beyond the understanding of those who had enslaved her. And though she remained locked in the hut, rags clinging to her body, the girl knew that the work she had poured herself into would speak when the world least expected it, transforming the chains of oppression into threads of power that even the tyrant could not withstand. The hall of the chief's grand estate shimmered with gilded decorations, polished wood and crystal chandeliers that reflected the firelight in dazzling patterns. The air was thick with the scent of spiced meats, roasted grains and perfumed oils, mingling with the voices of courtiers, guests, and sycophants who had come to witness the chief's extravagance. Laughter rang out in the spacious hall, mingled with the clinking of golden goblets and the whispers of those who admired power or feared its reach. Yet beneath the surface of pomp and ceremony, a tension rippled through the air, subtle but undeniable, as if some unseen force watched the proceedings with judgment in its eyes. The stepfamily moved among the guests with forced smiles and exaggerated gestures of pride. Each boasting word they uttered seemed to puff them up like inflated balloons, as if they believed their manipulation of the young seamstress and her skill could impress even the most discerning eye. "The gown will be unlike anything ever worn," the elder stepmother proclaimed loudly, her eyes darting to the girl who remained near the shadows, silent and trembling. "See how the stars themselves have been captured in fabric." Her sister added with a sneer, "And all by the hands of our humble servant." Their voices dripped with triumph and malice, each syllable a reminder of the cruelty they had imposed on the girl, as if her suffering were a measure of their power. The young seamstress, clothed in the rags of her servitude, was guided forward, her hands still tinged with the lingering pain of needle pricks and the blood that had soaked into the threads of the gown. Her heart pounded not from fear of the assembled crowd but from the awareness that the gown now possessed a life of its own, a spirit intertwined with her endurance, sorrow, and the ancestral whispers that had guided her through nights of toil. The gown glimmered softly under the flickering lantern light, its moonlit glow weaving and shifting as if it breathed. It was more than cloth, it was a living testament to justice, a vessel of power disguised as beauty, and the stepfamily could not yet comprehend the forces they had set in motion. As the chief approached, clad in robes of deep crimson and adorned with chains of gold, the stepfamily's gloating intensified. They gestured grandly toward the girl, insisting that she present the gown to the tyrant. "See, chief," the elder stepmother said, her voice triumphant, "she will dress you herself. Witness her skill, and you will know that no hand in the land is finer than hers." The chief's eyes glittered with avarice and pride as he extended his arms, expecting the girl to drape the garment over his shoulders. "Bring it here," he commanded, his voice echoing through the hall. "I will wear it and all will know my superiority." The girl's chest tightened as she moved forward. Each step felt heavier, not from the weight of the hall or the gaze of hundreds, but from the anticipation of the confrontation that was about to unfold. The threads of the gown seemed to twitch and shimmer, almost as though warning her of the impending moment when the power she had infused into the fabric would awaken fully. She was no longer simply a seamstress. She was the conduit of a living, breathing instrument of reckoning. Her hands, though trembling with exhaustion, held steady, guided by the ancestral whispers that urged her forward. The crowd held its breath, the cacophony of laughter and music fading into a tense silence as the girl reached the chief. She lifted the gown, letting its soft, glowing fabric cascade like liquid moonlight toward the tyrant. The threads gleamed unnaturally, glinting as if alive, reflecting patterns that shifted and coiled, subtly twisting around the fingers that grasped them. The chief extended his arms, but as the gown touched him, a faint hiss escaped the hall, almost imperceptible like the whisper of a snake. A chill ran through the air, unnoticed by most but palpable to those sensitive to the world's hidden rhythms. The gown resisted, sliding slightly against the chief's hands as if testing him, recognizing the malice and greed in his heart. It shimmered and glowed brighter, threads weaving subtly into shapes reminiscent of serpents and coiling vines. The stepfamily watched with a mixture of delight and impatience, believing they had mastered the girl's skill and that the gown was a simple creation, obedient to their commands. They did not notice the faint tightening, the subtle tension that ran along the threads, as if the gown itself were alive and aware, preparing to deliver the consequences of their cruelty. The girl moved with care, attempting to drape the gown over the chief's shoulders, but each thread seemed to resist, slipping away from his grasp. The luminescence grew, radiating an inner fire, as if fueled by the injustice that had created it. Guests gasped at the ethereal beauty, but the aura of the gown carried something else too, a quiet warning, a sense of impending reckoning. The stepsisters' smug expressions faltered slightly as they sensed the shift in energy, though they could not yet comprehend the transformation. Then, with a subtle but undeniable motion, the gown began to respond fully to the magic woven into it by the seamstress. The threads coiled around the chief's arms and shoulders, tightening not with force but with will. The golden embroidery glinted sharply, like tiny blades, and for the first time, the stepfamily noticed a dangerous life in the fabric. The chief's confident grin faltered, eyes widening as he realized that the garment did not obey him. The gown, shimmering with a strange, almost sentient light, began to move of its own accord. It wrapped around the tyrant, adjusting and twisting, securing him firmly in its glowing embrace. The room fell into silence, save for the whispering hum that seemed to emanate from the gown itself, a chorus of ancestral voices murmuring judgments long overdue. Panic rippled across the stepfamily. They called out, urging the girl to loosen the gown, to stop the enchantment, but she remained calm, guided by the spirits that had accompanied her through her nights of toil. Every stitch, every drop of her blood in the threads, had infused the gown with purpose, to protect her dignity and punish those who sought to exploit her. The glow intensified and the chief struggled, his arrogance replaced by fear as the gown refused to yield, wrapping him tightly, binding him like a serpent ensnaring its prey. The guests, initially entertained, now murmured in fear and awe. The stepsisters shrieked, their mockery turning to horror as they realized that the very cloth they had sought to claim for vanity and power had become an instrument of justice. The hall trembled subtly as if the spirits themselves were witnessing the moment, approving the girl's restraint and the gown's righteous wrath. The chief could do nothing. His wealth, his authority, and his pride were powerless against the living threads. With every movement, the gown tightened, its shimmering threads cutting into the chief's vanity and exposing the vulnerability beneath his gilded exterior. The stepfamily attempted to pull him free, but the garment resisted, coiling tighter, controlled not by human hands but by the will of the girl and the spirits that guided her. The hall was filled with a mixture of gasps, murmurs and silent awe. No one dared intervene, understanding that this was beyond mere magic, it was justice manifest. The young seamstress stood back, calm and resolute as the chief struggled. She had not raised her voice nor uttered a curse. All she had done was endure, work with integrity, and let the gown, imbued with her spirit and the whispers of ancestors, execute the reckoning. It was a triumph of resilience and purity over cruelty and greed, a living testament to the power of enduring virtue. By the time the feast ended, the chief's arrogance had been stripped away entirely, and the hall itself seemed transformed. The gown, glowing with its mystical light, had turned the tables, demonstrating that the girl's skill and her ancestors' guidance could protect her dignity and punish those who sought to exploit it. The stepfamily fled in shame, understanding too late that their cruelty had only strengthened the power they had sought to misuse. The seamstress, though weary, held herself with pride, her heart filled with quiet satisfaction, knowing that justice had been served without a single raised hand. The hall, once filled with laughter and applause, now fell into a tense hush as the chief tried to move within the silken embrace of the gown. Its threads, woven by the young seamstress and imbued with her blood, tears, and the whispers of ancestors, began to tighten with a will of their own. At first, the motion was subtle, just enough to make the tyrant fidget, tugging at the edges, trying to regain control over the garment. His expression shifted from smug anticipation to confusion, then to unease, as though the gown were testing him, gauging his arrogance and greed before delivering its judgment. The threads shimmered in a strange, almost spectral light, moving like tiny serpents across the chief's skin. They were delicate yet unyielding, flexible yet precise, each stitch guided by the spirits embedded within. As the gown adjusted itself, it began to constrict, curling along the lines of his body. The seams, almost invisible at first, began to bite with invisible blades, cutting not through ordinary flesh but through the pride, cruelty and vanity that had long defined him. Each tightening sent shivers down the tyrant's spine, igniting fear he had never before experienced. The crowd, initially enraptured by the brilliance of the gown, murmured in confusion as the chief's movements became frantic. Some whispered that this was part of a grand performance, a display of the seamstress' unmatched skill and the magical beauty of the cloth. But as the chief struggled and twisted, pale streaks began to appear through the luminous fabric. At first subtle, almost like moonlight reflecting off water, they quickly darkened into crimson lines, glinting like rubies against the glowing threads. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. The audience's admiration was replaced with horror, and even the stepfamily froze in terror, their arrogance evaporating like mist under the sun. The chief's face contorted, a mask of disbelief and agony. What is this?" he stammered, clawing at the gown, trying to tear himself free. But the threads, imbued with the seamstress' endurance and the spirit's wrath, would not yield. Each movement he made only tightened the grip further, forcing the seams to cut deeper, not through his body in a mortal sense but through the essence of his tyranny and hubris. The cries of the chief echoed throughout the hall, a sound that mingled both fear and realization, and for the first time, those who had served him or feared him began to understand the true cost of cruelty. The stepfamily, who had once gloated over the girl's plight, were now paralyzed with dread. They shouted and tried to intervene, grasping at the gown, hoping to free the chief before the damage became irreversible. But the gown ignored their frantic tugging. Its threads, like serpentine fingers, moved with intent, guided by justice rather than human hands. The ancestral spirits, whispering softly through the weave of the fabric, ensured that every prick, every cut, served as a lesson for the tyrant and a warning to all who sought to exploit and harm the seamstress. The hall itself seemed to respond to the gown's wrath. Candles flickered violently, shadows danced across the walls, and the floor seemed to pulse with a subtle vibration. The wind from open windows swept through the hall, carrying murmurs that sounded like a chorus of voices whispering judgment. Even the animals in the courtyard, sensing the shift, began to stir uneasily, their instinct recognizing the presence of power beyond human comprehension. The chief's screams, initially muffled and drowned in the general noise of the feast, now took on a new resonance, each cry a testament to the unraveling of his arrogance. Blood seeped through the glowing fabric, dark red against the moonlit threads, and the hall could no longer mistake this for theatrical display. Murmurs of disbelief turned into shouts of fear, and those who had once celebrated the chief's grandeur now stepped back, watching in awe as the garment exacted its mystical justice. Despite the pain inflicted upon the tyrant, the seamstress herself remained serene, her hands steady, her heart calm. She did not curse, shout, or threaten. She simply let the gown do what it was always meant to do: translate her suffering, endurance, and the spirit's guidance into a living instrument of reckoning. Her blood, sweat, and tears, woven into the fabric, ensured that every stitch carried purpose, every thread a reminder of the consequences of greed and cruelty. As the night wore on, the chief's struggles grew weaker. The more he thrashed, the tighter the threads coiled, emphasizing that no amount of resistance could reverse the justice woven into the cloth. The hall, filled with stunned villagers and guests, remained silent except for the occasional crackle of the enchanted threads and the muffled cries of the tyrant. The seamstress, though exhausted beyond measure, stood with dignity, a living conduit of righteousness, her presence commanding respect not through fear but through the undeniable power of integrity and the spirit's favor. By the end, the chief lay bound within the gown's glowing embrace, humbled, bloodied, and stripped of his false grandeur. His cries faded into whimpers, and the hall, now filled with the awe of those who had witnessed the miracle, became a space of reflection and understanding. The stepfamily, who had sought to exploit her talent for vanity and gain, realized that true power did not lie in manipulation or cruelty but in resilience, skill, and the unseen forces that protect the innocent. The gown, shimmering softly now, had returned to its intended purpose: a testament to justice, a symbol of the seamstress' enduring spirit, and a lesson to all who had sought to abuse her gifts. And though the feast had begun with arrogance and pride, it ended in a quiet reverence for the one who had transformed suffering into strength, pain into power, and threads into justice. The hall, still echoing with the terrified cries of the stepfamily and the tyrant chief, fell into an uneasy silence. The air felt thick with awe, as if time itself had slowed to witness the seamstress' quiet triumph. No one moved, no one dared approach, for the magic she had woven into the threads still lingered, an invisible force that reminded all present of the cost of cruelty and the power of innocence. For the first time since she had been forced into this nightmare, the young seamstress stood tall. Her shoulders, once hunched under the weight of exhaustion and fear, were straightened, and her chin lifted as if she were greeting the ancestors who had guided her hand and her spirit. Her eyes glowed faintly, like coals smoldering under ashes, a sign that the spirits had not only heard her pleas but had now fully embraced her as their chosen vessel. The threads, once instruments of vengeance and warning, retracted slightly but remained alive, poised to respond if another malicious act arose. The hall seemed to recognize the shift in energy, even the shadows lengthened in reverence, bowing subtly toward her presence. The stepfamily and the tyrant, still ensnared by the living threats, could only watch, wide-eyed and trembling. Their arrogance, their mockery had been replaced by terror and humility. They saw not just a girl before them but a conduit of ancestral justice, a force that no human cruelty could bind or break. Every stitch she had sewn, every drop of her blood mingled with the fabric, had transformed into a protective, righteous power that spoke louder than any sword, any command, any threat ever could. The villagers, many of whom had witnessed her suffering in silence, began to murmur among themselves. These whispers, at first cautious, soon grew into reverent acknowledgement. The crowd, which had once been complicit through fear and passivity, bowed slightly, not in subjugation to the girl, but in recognition of the higher justice she represented. Children looked up wide-eyed, elders nodded knowingly, and even the guards who had once bound her hands lowered their heads in silent respect. They understood that the power she now held was not her own alone. It belonged to the spirits who had always watched, to the ancestors who had guided her, and to the moral law of the universe that they had dared to defy. For the seamstress, this moment was not about vengeance. Her heart, still tender and compassionate despite the torment she endured, beat with a quiet determination. She did not laugh, she did not shout. Her presence alone radiated the correction of balance. Her stance, firm and unyielding, communicated a message that needed no words. Cruelty would never prosper where innocence and virtue were protected. She had not lifted a sword, yet the punishment she had woven into the threads of the cursed gown had rendered the oppressors powerless. The hall itself seemed to respond to her newfound strength. The walls, once oppressive and echoing with mockery, now felt like a protective cocoon, reinforcing her authority without fear or aggression. Light reflected off the shimmering gown she had crafted, not revealing the remnants of her torment but illuminating her triumph. The threads, still alive, seemed to pulse gently, a heartbeat that synchronized with her own, affirming that she was no longer a victim but a chosen agent of justice. Voices among the crowd began to rise in awe and acknowledgement. "The spirits have chosen her," one whispered. Another murmured, "No harm shall come to her while they watch." Even those who had doubted the young girl's strength felt the undeniable truth of her power. Respect replaced fear, admiration replaced resentment. The moral of the moment was unmistakable. True strength does not come from dominance over others but from the courage to endure, to persevere, and to align with higher principles. The Steppe family, now humbled and broken, could feel the weight of their misdeeds pressing upon them. Their attempts to control and humiliate had been undone not by violence or rebellion but by the very innocence and skill they sought to suppress. Their gazes were fixed on her, wide with terror yet tinged with understanding. They had witnessed firsthand the consequences of envy and cruelty when faced with a spirit guided by justice. As the seamstress held her ground, she became a living symbol of transformation. Her hands, once bound, now hung free, yet they carried the invisible memory of chains turned into threads of consequence. Her presence reminded every soul in the hall that actions have weight, that the energy one releases into the world cannot be contained when it is guided by spirit and truth. The very act of standing tall, unarmed yet unwavering, made her legend take root even before the echoes of the night faded. By the time she turned her gaze across the hall, she saw more than just fear or reverence in the eyes of the onlookers. She saw awakening, villagers realizing the power of compassion, the value of integrity, and the inevitability of justice. She saw that her suffering had not been in vain, that her endurance had created a ripple effect that would influence hearts and minds far beyond the walls of the hall. And so she stood, radiant and unbroken, a testament to the truth that courage, purity of heart, and alignment with higher powers could transform despair into triumph, chains into liberation, and helplessness into awe-inspiring authority. The crowd's whispers grew into murmurs of respect, and the world seemed, at least for that moment, balanced, fair, and guided by the unseen hand of justice. The air inside the grand hall was thick with tension and smoke, a suffocating reminder of the chaos the cursed gown had unleashed. Flames licked the walls and ceiling, feeding on the timbers that had once held the laughter and arrogance of the tyrant and his guests. The once luxurious hall, adorned with gilded decorations and fine tapestries, now seemed to groan under the weight of its own corruption. Every beam, every chandelier, every carved ornament bore witness to the wrath that had been quietly brewing through the seamstress' hands, her spirit, and the vigilant threads of the enchanted gown. The tyrant, writhing in pain from the gown's biting threads, could barely comprehend what was happening. His eyes darted wildly as the threads seemed to pulse with a life independent of the girl who had woven them. The hall shuddered and vibrated, as if the walls themselves had taken sides, siding with justice and righteousness against his cruelty. His stepfamily, who had thought themselves safe in their mockery and exploitation, now scrambled in panic, realizing that the power they had once attempted to command was far beyond their understanding, or their control. Cracks ran across the marble floors, spreading in spiderweb patterns, splitting the once smooth surface into jagged shards. Candles toppled, spilling wax onto the threads that still shimmered with the mixture of blood and ancestral magic. The windows rattled, and the wind tore through the hall with a force that seemed unnatural, whistling warnings to those who had abused the seamstress. The feast, intended as a celebration of opulence and dominance, had become a theater of reckoning, a testament to the unstoppable consequences of cruelty and greed. The guests screamed and rushed toward the exits, their voices rising in a cacophony of terror. Tables overturned, sending silverware and platters clattering across the floor, and the walls, now cracking and splitting, threatened to collapse at any moment. The storm outside, seemingly summoned by the same ancestral spirits that guided the girl's hands, intensified. Rain beat against the open windows, lightning streaked across the sky, and thunder shook the hall as though the heavens themselves were punishing the tyrant for his hubris. Amid the chaos, the cursed gown continued its work. Its threads, still shimmering and alive, bound the tyrant's stepfamily where they had once laughed and mocked. Panic and pain overtook them as they realized that their attempts to control another human being had only made them instruments of their own suffering. The threads slithered, coiled, and tightened with precision, ensuring that every moment of arrogance was met with a proportional measure of consequence. The hall, the storm, the magic of the gown, and the girl's unbroken spirit converged into a singular force that neither human strength nor fear could resist. Yet through it all, the seamstress herself remained untouched. She walked calmly among the chaos, her steps measured and unwavering. Her eyes, reflecting the glow of fire and magical light, remained fixed ahead, her focus absolute. She did not falter when beams fell or when guests shrieked and scattered. It was as if the spirits had woven an invisible shield around her, protecting her from the violence she had wrought only as a necessary measure of justice. Every step she took was deliberate, her presence a living testament to the power of endurance, purity, and righteous intervention. The tyrant, now writhing beneath the gown, screamed in agony, each thread biting deeper, leaving marks that glowed faintly with mystical fire. His empire, built on fear, oppression, and exploitation, began to crumble. Walls fell, ceilings collapsed, and the opulent hall that had symbolized his reign of terror was reduced to splintered wood, shattered glass, and smoldering ash. Survivors fled into the night, their faces pale with terror, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the cruelty they had condoned or participated in had summoned a reckoning beyond their comprehension. Outside, the storm raged as if to cleanse the land itself. Rain washed over the ruins, carrying away the smoke, the blood, and the lingering energies of anger and vengeance. The cries of the guilty faded into the night, replaced by the solemn hush of awe and the distant rumble of nature reasserting balance. The cursed gown, now freed from its mortal weave, hung slightly on the girl's shoulders, no longer biting or binding. Its purpose had been fulfilled, serving as both instrument and witness of justice delivered. The seamstress stepped out of the burning ruin, her feet unscorched, her hands unharmed. She walked into the night, illuminated only by the flashes of lightning and the dying embers of the hall behind her. Her figure, calm and resolute, stood in stark contrast to the chaos she had left in her wake. She carried no sword, no shield, no weapon of mortal design. Yet her presence alone had toppled a tyrant and shattered the illusions of power that had imprisoned and oppressed so many. In the silence that followed, the villagers who had witnessed the destruction understood the magnitude of what had occurred. The feast, intended to celebrate arrogance and exploitation, had become a legend in itself. The girl, the gown, and the spirits she served had demonstrated that true power lies not in cruelty or domination but in resilience, justice, and the alignment of human effort with higher forces. Her departure from the ruins marked the beginning of a new understanding, a cautionary tale of respect, humility, and the inevitability of cosmic balance. And so she walked into the night, untouched, unbroken, and untamed, a living legend whose courage and purity had transformed a hall of pride into a story of justice, a tyrant's feast into a warning, and a humble girl into an immortal symbol of righteous power.